Hello learners, I am Dr. Simranjeet Kaur, Professor and Principal School of Law, City University, Ludhiana. Welcome to this session on Analytical Jurisprudence and Liberal Democracy. In this lecture, we will explore the evolution of democracy from its origin in the ancient Greece to the modern liberal democratic models, delving into the key concept, critiques and the figures who have shaped democratic thought. The focus will also be on contrasting direct and representative democracy and the role of liberalism in the shaping contemporary democratic governance. Understanding these ideas is essential for the comprehending the complex relationship between the political authority, civil rights and the role of individuals within the democratic systems. By the end of this session, you will be able to understand the historical evolution of the democracy and its transformation from the pejorative concept to the widely accepted form of governance. Differentiate between the direct and the representative democracy with example from the ancient and the modern societies. Analyze the principle of liberal democracy, including the separation of powers, rule of law and protection of civil liberties. Critically examine the challenges to the liberal democracy from both external factors and internal populist movements. Recognize the contribution of the key thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Joseph Schumpeter and the Crawford Bro Macpherson to the democratic theory. After completing this session, learners will be able to explain the significance of the democratic models in shaping the governance structures globally. Evaluate the strengths and the limitations of the liberal democracy in addressing contemporary political and social challenges. Articulate the role of citizen participation in both direct and representative democracies. Discuss the historical and philosophical contribution of the key thinkers to the democratic thought. Apply critical thinking to the evolving discourse on the democracy, including issues surrounding populism and governance frameworks. So let's begin this insightful journey into the dynamic world of democracy and jurisprudence. The term democracy and the classical conception of democratic rule are firmly rooted in the ancient Greece. Like other words that end in the cracy, such as autocracy, aristocracy and bureaucracy, democracy is derived from the ancient Greek word kratos, meaning power or rule. Democracy therefore means rules by the demos, demos standing for the many or the people. In contrast, it's the modern uses. Democracy was originally a negative or pejorative term, denoting not so much rule by all as rule by the propertyless and uneducated masses. Democracy was therefore thought to be the enemy of the liberty and wisdom. While writers such as Aristotle were prepared to recognize the virtue of the popular participation, they nevertheless feared that restrained democracy would generate into the form of the mob rule. Indeed, such pejorative implications continued to be attached to the democracy until well into the 20th century. Democratic government has, however, varied considerably over the centuries. Perhaps the most fundamental distinction is between democratic systems like those in ancient Greece that are based upon direct popular participation in government and those that operate through some kind of representative mechanism. This highlights two contrasting models of democracy: direct democracy and representative democracy. Moreover, the modern understanding of the democracy is dominated by the form of electoral democracy that has developed in the industrialized West, often called liberal democracy. Despite its undoubted success, liberal democracy is the only one of a number of possible models of the democracy, and one whose democratic credentials have sometimes been called into the question. Finally, the near universal approval which democracy currently elicits should not obscure the fact that the merits of the democracy have been fiercely debated over the centuries, and that in certain respect this debate has intensified in the late 20th century. In other words, democracy may have its vices as well as its virtues. Meaning of democracy. Let's discuss what is the meaning of democracy. Democracy is the liberal political ideology and a form of the government in which representative democracy operates under the principles of classical liberalism. It is characterized by the elections between multiple distinct political parties, a separation of powers into the different branches of the government, the rule of law in everyday life as a part of an open society, a market economy with the private property and the equal protection of human rights, civil liberties and political freedom for all the people. To define the system in practice, liberal democracies often draw upon a constitution to delineate the power of the government and enshrine the social contract. After a period of sustained expansion throughout the 20th century, liberal democracy became the predominant political system in the world. A liberal democracy may take various constitutional forms as it may be constitutional monarchy or a republic. It may have a parliamentary system, a presidential system or a semi-presidential system. Liberal democracies usually have universal suffrage, granting all adult citizens the right to vote regardless of ethnicity, sex, property, ownership, race, age, sexuality, gender, income, social status, religions, etc. The liberal democratic constitution defines the democratic character of the state. The purpose of the constitution is often seen as the limit on the authority of the government. Liberal democracy emphasizes the separation of powers, an independent judiciary and a system of check and balances between the branches of the government, and media plays the role of fourth estate. Liberal democracies are likely to emphasize the importance of following the principle of rule of law. Governmental authority is legitimately exercised only in accordance with the written, publicly disclosed laws, adopted and enforced in accordance with the established procedures. Many democracies use federalism, also known as vertical separation of powers, in order to prevent abuse and increase public input by dividing governing powers between the municipal, provincial and the national government. The rights and the freedoms protected by the constitution of the liberal democracies are varied, but they usually include most of the following: rights to due the process, privacy, property and equality before the law, and freedom of speech, assembly and the religion. In liberal democracies, these rights, also known as liberal rights, may sometimes be constitutionally guaranteed or are otherwise created by the statutory law or the case law, which may in turn empower various civil institutions to administer or enforce these rights. Liberal democracies also tend to be characterized by the tolerance and pluralism, widely differing social and the political views. Even those viewed as extreme or fringe are permitted to coexist and compete for the political power on a democratic basis. Liberal democracies periodically holds elections where groups with the differing political views have the opportunity to achieve the political power. The term liberal in the liberal democracies does not imply that the government of such democracy must follow the political ideology of the liberalism. It is merely a reference to the fact that the initial framework for the modern liberal democracy was created during the age of enlightenment by the philosophers advocating the liberty. They emphasized the right of the individual to have immunity from the arbitrary exercise of authority. At present, there are numerous different political ideologies that support liberal democracies. Examples include conservatism, Christian democracy, social democracy, and some form of socialism. According to the William A. Galston, liberal democracies faces multiple external challenges from ethno-national autocracies, from regimes claiming to be based on God's word rather than the will of the people, from the success of the strong-headed meritocracies in the places such as Singapore, and not least from the astonishing economic accomplishments of China's market Leninist system. But there is also an internal challenge to the liberal democracy, a challenge from the populist who seeks to drive a wedge between democracy and liberalism. Liberal norms and policies, they claim, weaken democracy and harm the people. Thus, liberal institutions that prevent the people from acting democratically in their own interest should be set aside. Gaston writes that some observers contended that popularism is not without the merit. It represents an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism, and thus is less an attack on democracy than a corrective to the deficits thereof. These observers argue that elites, by taking important issues such as economic, monetary and the regulatory policies of the public agendas and assigning them to the institution insulted from the public scrutiny and influence, have invited precisely the popular revolt that now threatens to overwhelm them. The key figures: Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau viewed democracy as the most important means through which humans can achieve freedom or autonomy, in the sense of the obedience to the law one prescribes to oneself. He was a strenuous critique of the practice of the elections and insisted that citizens are only free when they participate directly and continuously in shaping the life of their community. For Rousseau, this ultimately meant obedience to the general will, although he was less clear about the precise mechanism through which the general will would emerge. Joseph Schumpeter, a Moravian-born U.S. economist and the socialist, Schumpeter developed an analysis of the capitalism that emphasized its bureaucratic tendencies and its growing resemblance to the socialism. His theory of the democracies offered an alternative to the classical doctrine, which was based upon the idea of a shared notion of the common good. It portrayed the democratic process as an arena of the struggle between power-seeking politicians intent upon winning the people's vote. His view that political democracy is the analogous to an economic market had considerable influence upon the later rational choice theories. Schumpeter's most important political work is Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. In year 1942, Cromford Roe McPherson, a Canadian political theorist, McPherson developed a leftist form of liberalism that reflects the influences of the Marxism. He portrayed early liberalism as a form of possessive individualism, interestingly linked to the market society. His critique of the liberal democracies stressed liberalism's pre-democratic features and acknowledge its bias in the favor of capitalism. Nevertheless, he argued that the basic liberal democratic principle of the equal liberty would ultimately be realized, but only within the condition of the participatory democracy and in a non-market social environment. Now, we will discuss the direct and indirect democracy. In the Gettysburg Address delivered at the time of the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln extolled the virtues of what he called the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In so doing, he defined between two contrasting notions of the democracy. The first, the government by the people, is based upon the idea that the public participates in the government and indeed governs itself. The second, government for the people, is linked to the notion of the public interest and the idea that the government benefits the people, whether or not they themselves rule. The classical conception of the democracy, which endured well into the 19th century, was firmly rooted in the ideal of the popular participation and drew heavily upon the example of the Athenian democracy. The cornerstone of the Athenian democracy was the direct and the continuous participation of all the citizens in the life of their polis or city-state. This amounted to the form of government by the mass meeting, and each citizen was qualified to hold public offices if selected to do so by lot or a rota. Athenian democracy was therefore a system of direct democracy, or what is sometimes referred to as a participatory democracy. By removing the need for the separate class of the professional politicians, the citizens themselves were able to rule directly, obliterating the distinction between the government and the governed and between the state and the civil society. Similar system of the town meeting democracy continued to be practiced at a local level in some part of the USA, notably in the New England and in the communal assemblies employed in the Switzerland. The town meeting is, however, not the only means through which direct democracy can operate. The most obvious of these is the plebiscite or referendum, a popular vote on a specific issue which enables electors to make the decisions directly, instead of selecting politicians to do so of their own behalf. Referendums are widely used at every level in Switzerland and are employed in the countries such as Ireland to ratify constitutional amendments. The UK held as a referendum in 1975 on continued membership of then European Community. In 1979, an establishing developed assemblies in Scotland and Wales, and since the election of the Blair government in 1997. Referendums have been held on Scottish and Welsh devolution, the Northern Ireland peace deal, and the introduction of the London mayor. In the USA, referendums have increasingly been used in the local politics in the form of propositions or popular initiatives. A form of direct democracy has also survived in the modern societies in the practice of selecting juries on the basis of lot or rota. As public offices were filled in the Athenian times, advocates of direct democracy further pointed out that the development of the modern technology has opened up broader possibilities for the popular participation in the government. In particular, the use of so-called interactive television could enable the citizens to both watch public debates and engage in voting without ever leaving their homes. Experiments with such technologies are already underway in some local communities in the United States. Needless to say, the modern government bears the little resemblance to the Athenian model of the direct democracy. Government is left in the hands of the professional politicians who are invested with the responsibility for making the decisions on behalf of the people. Representative democracy is at the best a limited and the undirected form of democracy. It is limited in the sense that the popular participation is both infrequent and brief, being reduced to the act of voting every few years, depending on the length of the political term. It is indirect in the sense that the public is kept at arm's length from the government. The public participates only through the choice of who should govern it, and never or only rarely exercise power itself. Representative democracy may nevertheless qualify as a form of democracy on the grounds that however limited and ritualized it may appear, the act of a voting remains a vital source of popular power. Quite simply, the public has the ability to kick the rascals out, a fact that ensures public accountability. Although representative democracy may not fully realize the classical goals of the government by the people, it may nevertheless make the possible a form of government for the people. Some advocates of the representative democracy acknowledge its limitation, but argue that it is the only practicable form of democracy in modern conditions. A high level of the popular participation is possible within relatively small communities, such as Greek city-states or small towns, because face-to-face communication can take place between amongst the citizens. However, the idea of the government by mass meeting being conducted in the modern nation states containing tens and possibly hundreds of the millions of the citizens is frankly absurd. Moreover, to consult the general public on each and every issue and permit wide-ranging debate and discussion threatens to paralyze the decision-making process and make a country virtually ungovernable. The most fundamental objection to the direct democracy is, however, that ordinary people lack the time, maturity and specialist knowledge to rule wisely on their own behalf. In this sense, representative democracy merely applies the advantages of the division of the labor to the politics. Specialist politicians able to devote all their time and energy to the activity of the government can clearly do a better job than would the general public. Nevertheless, since the 1960s, there has been revival of the interest in classical democracy and in particular in the idea of the participation. This reflects growing discontentment with the bureaucratic and unresponsive nature of the modern government, as well as declining respect for the professional politicians who have increasingly been viewed as self-serving careerists. In addition, the act of voting is often seen as a meaningless ritual that has little impact upon the policy process, making a mockery of the democratic ideal. Civil disengagement and declining electoral turnout in many parts of the world are thus sometimes viewed as symptoms of the malaise of the representative democracy. Liberal democracy, Bernard Crick has pointed out that democracy is the most promiscuous of the political terms, in the sense that the word means different things to the different people. Democracy is an example, an assembly contested concept. No settled model of democracy exists, only a number democracy has come to dominate thinking on the matter to the extent that many in the West treat it as the only feasible or meaningful form of the democracy. This is liberal democracy. This is found in almost all the advanced capitalist society and now extends in one form or another into the parts of the former communist world and developing world. Indeed, the right of the collapse of the communism, the U.S. new right theorist Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the worldwide triumph of the liberal democracy, describing it as the end of the history, by which he meant that the struggle between the political ideas, many Western states, for instance, developed forms of the constitutional government in the 19th century. At the time when the franchisee was still restricted to the proprietary males, in fact, women in the Switzerland did not get the vote until 1971. A liberal state is based upon the principle of limited government, the idea that individuals should enjoy some measure of protection from the state. From the liberal perspective, government is necessary evil, always liable to become a tyranny against the individual if the government power is not checked. This leads to support for the devices designed to constrain government, such as Constitution, a Bill of Rights, an independent judiciary, and a network of check and balances amongst the institutions of the government. Liberal democracies, moreover, respect the existence of the vigorous and healthy civil societies, based upon respect for the civil liberties and the property rights. Liberal democratic rules, therefore, typically coexist with the capitalist economic order. However, although these features may be necessarily precondition for the democracy, they should not be mistaken for the democracy itself. The democratic element in the liberal democracy is the idea of the popular consent, expressed in the practice through the act of voting. Liberal democracy is thus a form of electoral democracy, in that popular election is seen as the only legitimate source of the political authority. Such elections must, however, respect the principles of the political equality. They must be based upon the universal suffrage and the idea of one person, one vote. For this reason, any system that restricts voting right on the grounds of gender, race, religion, economic status, or whatever fails to democratic test. Finally, in order to be fully democratic, elections must be regular, open, and above all competitive. The core of the democratic process is the capacity of the people to call politicians to account, political pluralism, open competition between the political philosophies, movements, parties, and so on is thus thought to be the essence of the democracy. The attraction of the liberal democracy is its capacity to blend elite rule with the significant measure of the popular participation. Government is entrusted to the professional politicians, but these politicians are forced to respond to the popular pressures by the simple fact that the public put them there in the first place and can later remove them. Joseph Scumter summed this up in Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy by describing that democratic method as the institutional arrangement for arriving at the political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. Thus, the virtues of the elite rule government by experts, the educated or well informed, are balanced against the need for the public accountability. Indeed, such a view implies that in liberal democracies, political power is ultimately wielded by the voters at the election time. The voter exercises the same power in the political market as the consumer does in the economic markets. This process of accountability is strengthened by the capacity of the citizens to exert direct influence upon the government through the formation of cause groups and interest groups. Liberal democracies are therefore described as a pluralist democracies. Within them, political power is widely dispersed among a number of competing groups and interests, each of which has the access to the government. Nevertheless, liberal democracy does not command universal approval or respect. Its principal critiques have been elitist, Marxist and the radical democrats. Elitists are distinguished by their belief that political power is concerned in the hands of the few, the elite, whereas classical elites believe that this to be as necessary and in many cases desirable feature of the political life. Modern elites have developed an essentially empirical analysis and usually regretted the concentration of the political power. Liberal democracies are thus capitalist or bourgeois democracies manipulated and controlled by the entrenched power of the private property, such as analysis inclined revolutionary Marxists such as Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg to reject the idea that there can be democratic road to the socialism. An alternative tradition nevertheless recognizes that electoral democracy gives the working masses a voice and may even be a vehicle for far-reaching social change. In concluding remarks, radical democrats therefore underline the benefits that political participation brings, often by the reference to the writings of the Rousseau, J.S. Mill. While they suggest no single alternative to the liberal democracy, they have usually been prepared to endorse any reforms through which grassroots democracies can be brought about. These include not only the use of referendum and the information technology already discussed, but also the radical decentralizations of the power and wider use of the activist and campaigning pressure group rather than the bureaucratic and hierarchical political parties. Virtues and the vices of the democracy in the modern politics. There is a strange and perhaps unhealthy silence on the issue of the democracy. So broad is respect for the democracy that it has come to be taken for granted. Its virtues are seldom questioned and its vices rarely exposed. This is very different from the period of the English, American and the French Revolution, which witnessed the fierce and the continued debate about the merits of the democracy. Indeed, in the 19th century, when democracy was regarded as a radical, egalitarian and even revolutionary creed, no issue polarized political opinion so dramatically. The present unanimity about the democracy should not, however, disguise the fact that Democrats have defended their views in a very different way at different times. Until the 19th century, democracy, or at least the right to vote, was usually regarded as means of protecting the individual against overmighty government. Thank you for the participating in these sessions on analytical jurisprudence and the liberal democracy. I hope it has been provided you the valuable insight into the complexity and importance of the democratic governance. Remember, democracy is not just a system, but a shared responsibility that thrives on informed citizens' engagement. Stay curious, stay informed, and continue exploring the transformative power of democratic principles. See you all in the next sessions.